Welcome to Grimoxa, where history's greatest stories are told the way they deserve to be told. Tonight, we go back to a world that no longer exists, a world of crowns, empires, and dynasties that believed they would last forever. For centuries, Europe was not governed by nations alone. It was governed by families. Royal families whose bloodlines stretched across borders, whose marriages were treaties, and whose rivalries were wars. From the palaces of London to the winter courts of St. Petersburg, from the imperial halls of Berlin to the ancient throne rooms of Vienna, power wore a crown. These were not distant figureheads. These were the men and the women who commanded the largest armies ever assembled, who controlled the fate of hundreds of millions of people, and who genuinely believed, that their authority was divine and permanent. And then, in the space of 4 years, 4 of the greatest empires in human history collapsed into dust. Look at this map. Europe, circa 1900. On the surface, it appears ordered, confident, almost eternal. Vast empires stretch across the continent. The British, the German, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman. Each one commanding enormous armies, immense wealth, and the political destinies of hundreds of millions of people. Walk through the streets of London, Vienna, Berlin, or St. Petersburg in 1900, and what you would find is a world of extraordinary ceremony and power. Royal processions moved through cobblestone streets. Imperial palaces rose above every great capital. Monarchs signed decrees that moved armies and shaped borders. This was not a world that felt fragile, it felt permanent. The church bells rang on schedule. The carriages moved through ordered streets. The royal portraits stared down from palace walls with absolute authority. To the people living inside it, this world had always existed, and it always would. That confidence, that unshakable sense of permanence, is precisely what makes what came next so devastating. But understanding the scale of royal territory is only the beginning. Because in 1900, these monarchs were not ceremonial figures waving from palace balconies. They were decision makers with real, constitutional authority over the most consequential matters a nation could face. Military commands moved through royal signatures. Foreign alliances were negotiated through royal courts. Diplomatic relationships were built, broken, and reshaped by the personal beliefs and ambitions of individual rulers. Imperial flags flew over government buildings not as symbols, but as statements of living authority. When a monarch issued a decree, armies moved. When a monarch shifted his loyalties, borders trembled. And here is what makes this era so uniquely dangerous. The personality of a single monarch could determine whether a nation went to war. Not policy committees, not elected parliaments. One man, one temperament, one decision. These were not figureheads. They were the architects of national destiny. And to truly understand what shattered Europe in 1914, you must first understand the men and the women who sat on its thrones. To understand how cousins ended up commanding armies against each other, you must first understand the woman who made them family. Queen Victoria, monarch of Britain for 63 years, Empress of India, and, perhaps most consequentially, the grandmother of Europe. Through a carefully orchestrated series of royal marriages, Victoria's 9 children and 42 grandchildren spread across nearly every major throne on the continent. Her descendants sat in Britain, Germany, Russia, Greece, Romania, Spain, and beyond. She did not simply rule an empire, she built a dynasty that stretched across an entire civilization. And here lies the great historical irony. This one woman, who believed that binding Europe's royal families together through blood and marriage would create lasting peace, could not have imagined that those same families would one day lead the continent into the most catastrophic war in human history. The connections she forged with such care and intention would not prevent the coming destruction. In some ways, they would deepen it. And at the center of that catastrophe stood 3 of her grandsons, George, Wilhelm, and Nicholas, 3 cousins who would hold the fate of Europe in their hands. Among Victoria's grandsons, George Volz of Britain stood apart in temperament. Where others were volatile or indecisive, George was measured, disciplined, and deeply conscious of his constitutional boundaries. He understood that in Britain, the monarch reigned but the government ruled. Buckingham Palace may have commanded the world's largest empire, but George deferred to his ministers with quiet consistency. Yet behind that formality lived something deeply personal. George was genuinely close to both Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas, not merely as political counterparts, but as family. And his bond with Nicholas ran remarkably deep. The two men were so physically similar, same build, same beard, same eyes, that photographs of them standing together left observers genuinely confused about who was who. Side by side, they looked less like the rulers of rival empires and more like brothers. That closeness, however, would not be enough. When war arrived, George could not, or would not, use those personal bonds to stop it. And years later, when Nicholas faced execution, George's silence would become one of history's most haunting unanswered questions. Now we turn to the most volatile of Victoria's grandsons, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Where George was steady and Nicholas was passive, Wilhelm was something far more combustible. Brilliant, restless, and deeply insecure, he commanded the most militarily ambitious empire in Europe while simultaneously craving approval from Britain, the very country his grandmother had ruled. Wilhelm was born with a withered left arm, a physical disability he spent his entire life concealing. Some historians believe this shaped everything, that his aggressive posturing, his obsession with military pageantry, his desperate need to project dominance, were all forms of overcompensation for a wound that never healed. His Germany was expanding rapidly, its army, navy, and industrial power growing at a pace that alarmed every neighboring nation. And unlike George, Wilhelm did not simply follow his government's lead. He intervened, he provoked, and he escalated. His personal decisions in the summer of 1914 would help push Europe past the point of no return, but to understand the full picture, we must now travel east, to Russia. From the militaristic ambition of Berlin, we move east, deep into the vast frozen heart of the Russian Empire. Tsar Nicholas II was, by nearly every account, a gentle man. Devoted to his wife Alexandra, adoring of his 5 children, personally warm in ways that those who met him often found surprising. But gentleness is not the same as strength, and the throne of Russia demanded something Nicholas simply did not possess: the will to lead. He inherited the Romanov dynasty, 3 centuries of absolute imperial power, and with it an empire stretching across 11 time zones. Yet beneath that staggering scale lay something deeply unstable. Social unrest was spreading. Revolutionary ideas were moving through the population like fire through dry grass. Nicholas believed without question in his divine right to rule. That belief made reform feel like surrender. It made compromise feel like weakness. And so he held on, to tradition, to ceremony, to a world already crumbling beneath him. Next, we turn to Vienna, and the oldest monarch in Europe. While Nicholas struggled with Russia's vastness, another aging monarch faced a different kind of impossible burden. Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria-Hungary had ruled since 1848, longer than any other monarch in Europe. By 1914, he was 83 years old, a relic of another century, still sitting on a throne that the modern world was rapidly making irrelevant. His empire was unlike any other. Austria-Hungary was not a nation. It was a collection of nations forced together under one crown. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croatians, Slovenes, Bosnians, over a dozen languages spoken within a single empire, held together not by shared identity but by imperial tradition and military authority. Franz Joseph had outlived his wife, his son, and his era. He governed with discipline and duty, but the cracks in his empire ran deep. Many believed Austria-Hungary could not survive another generation. And yet this fragile empire would soon make the decision that lit the fuse of the entire war. But before we arrive at that moment, one more empire demands our attention: the Ottoman Empire, crumbling at Europe's southeastern edge. And then there was the Ottoman Empire, a civilization that had once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, commanding fear and respect across 3 continents. By 1914, however, the world had taken to calling it the sick man of Europe. Decades of military defeats, territorial losses, and internal fragmentation had left this once magnificent empire dangerously weakened. Sultan Mehmed V sat on the throne, but real power had shifted dramatically toward a revolutionary political movement known as the Young Turks. Nationalist reformers who believed alliance with Germany offered the empire its best chance at survival. It was a desperate gamble. The Ottomans entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, a decision that would not save them but instead accelerate their final collapse. As the Eastern orchestral undertones fade gently back into familiar European strings, we return to something that makes this entire story uniquely devastating. Because unlike the Ottomans, the European monarchs commanding these opposing armies were not distant rivals. They were family. Now look closely at this family tree. Watch it expand across Europe like roots beneath a continent. George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, three men commanding the largest armies in human history. First cousins. They had celebrated together at family gatherings, exchanged birthday letters, and called each other by childhood nicknames. Wilhelm was Willie. Nicholas was Nicky. In the final desperate days before war was declared, the two men exchanged personal telegrams, the famous Willie-Nicky correspondence, writing to each other not as emperors but as family, pleading for restraint, searching for a way back from the edge. The bond between them was absolutely real. You can feel it in every word. And yet, despite everything, the shared blood, the childhood memories, the personal letters, the telegrams sent at midnight, the war came anyway. And when it did, cousins commanded armies against each other across fields that would swallow millions. And then came the spark. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie were shot dead in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb connected to the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist secret society determined to break Austro-Hungarian control over Slavic peoples. The assassination did not cause the war. The war was already waiting. Decades of imperial rivalry, military buildup, and unresolved nationalist tension had turned Europe into a room filled with gunpowder. Princip simply struck the match. Austria-Hungary saw the killing as an opportunity, a justification to crush Serbian nationalism permanently. They issued a brutal ultimatum to Serbia. Germany handed Austria-Hungary a blank check of unconditional support. Russia began mobilizing in defense of Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France was pulled in. Britain followed. Within 6 weeks of 2 gunshots in Sarajevo, the most powerful empires on earth were at war with each other. The machinery moved faster than any monarch could stop it. Europe in 1914 was divided into 2 armed camps. On one side stood the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. On the other, the Triple Entente: Britain, France, and Russia. These alliances were built to guarantee security. Instead, they guaranteed that any single conflict would drag every major power into the fire. But alliances alone did not make war inevitable. Nationalism did. Across Europe, ordinary people were no longer defining themselves by which royal family ruled them. They were defining themselves by ethnicity, language, and national identity. That idea was more powerful than any royal bloodline. The monarchs understood the danger. Wilhelm sent telegrams to Nicholas. George consulted his ministers desperately. But the military timetables were already running. Mobilization orders could not be recalled. Nationalist crowds were demanding action. The machinery moved faster than the men who had built it. These kings and emperors had the relationships, the authority, and in some cases the genuine desire to stop what was coming. But the world had already moved beyond them. The war began. And with it, the slow, violent unraveling of everything they had built. The war broke Russia before it broke anyone else. Russian soldiers fought in brutal winter conditions, undersupplied and overwhelmed, dying for an empire that could no longer hold itself together. By early 1917, the streets of Petrograd were filled with revolutionary crowds demanding change that Nicholas II could not deliver. In March 1917, Nicholas abdicated. 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended not with ceremony, but with a signature on a piece of paper. What followed was quieter and far worse. In July 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children were taken to a basement in Yekaterinburg and executed by Bolshevik forces. One of the most powerful royal dynasties in history ended in a cellar. George Volz, Nicholas's cousin, had been asked to offer the family asylum in Britain. He declined. Historians have debated that decision ever since. The Romanovs were gone. Now the collapse moved west toward Germany. And then Germany itself began to break. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man who had spent his entire reign demanding respect from the world, abdicated on November 9th, 1918, just 2 days before the armistice silenced the guns. He fled across the border into the Netherlands, where he would spend the remaining decades of his life on a quiet country estate called Doorn. The man who had commanded the most powerful military force in Europe spent his exile cutting wood, not ruling, not commanding, just cutting wood day after day, forgotten by the world he had once tried to dominate. Almost simultaneously, the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved entirely, fragmenting into Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Austria, Hungary, and beyond. Centuries of imperial architecture collapsed within weeks. Animated maps show the old borders disappearing, replaced by new, uncertain lines drawn by exhausted men at peace conferences. 2 empires gone, 2 dynasties erased, and to the south, another ancient empire was already breathing its final breaths. And then there was the Ottoman Empire. Defeated and occupied, Constantinople fell under Allied control. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, departed in quiet humiliation. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk rose from the ruins, abolished the Sultanate in 1922, and built the modern Turkish Republic from the ashes of a 6th century empire. 4 empires gone. The kings and emperors who entered World War I believed the old order would survive. They believed their thrones, their dynasties, their divine right to rule would endure whatever came. Most of them were wrong. The war did not only destroy armies and cities, it destroyed the world those monarchs had built, the world they believed was permanent. Crowns do not protect against history. And history, in 1914, had already made its decision. That is the story of the monarchies of World War I.